In this video, I want to talk about the four major anatomical regions of the brain and their functions. Now, moving from superficial to deep, there's the cerebrum, or the cerebral cortex. Deep to that, you have the diencephalon, followed by the brainstem. And then on the posterior part of the brain is the cerebellum. We're going to talk about each of these regions in a little bit more detail throughout this unit, but generally speaking, we can associate the cortex with higher brain functions, the diencephalon with the regulation of homeostasis, the brainstem with really essential involuntary processes like cardiac function, respiratory function, and the cerebellum with the coordination of movements that we make with our muscles. Now, the nervous tissue in the brain and in the spinal cord is organized into white matter and gray matter. Gray matter contains the cell bodies and synapses of neurons. Most of the regions of the cortex that I'm going to be mentioning in this unit are examples of gray matter structures. White matter consists of myelinated axons. In the brain, this mostly describes the deeper aspects of the tissue. The whiteness comes from the myelin itself. The axons in the white matter in the brain are referred to as fibers, and they often connect different structures to each other. So, for example, the commissural fibers connect structures on the left to the structures on the right hemisphere of the brain. Association fibers connect different structures within the same cerebral hemisphere or side. The projection fibers connect the cerebral cortex to regions outside of the cortex. Now, the surface architecture of the brain is also really interesting. As opposed to being completely smooth, it's a system of hills and valleys. The raised portions, or the hills, are called gyri, or individually a gyrus, and the grooves, or valleys, are known as sulci, or individually as a sulcus. The system of hills and valleys increases the surface area for the exchange of ions with the CSF. So you remember back from the membrane transport unit that one of the ways to increase the efficiency of diffusion is to increase the membrane surface area. It also helps us to pack more brain tissue into the cranial vault. Now, we can actually use some of this architecture, and in particular the grooves, as landmarks to help us to define different regions of the brain. So, for example, the central sulcus separates the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex from the parietal lobe. A really deep sulcus is known as a fissure, and those create major separations. So, for example, the longitudinal fissure separates the left and right hemispheres of the brain from each other. The transverse fissure separates the cerebral cortex from the cerebellum, and the lateral fissure separates the temporal lobe from the other cortical regions. So I've organized this part of the unit to work from superficial to deep. Now in humans, the largest and most superficial part of the brain is the cerebral cortex. The cortex contains four lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Each of these lobes has a left and a right side. And one of the interesting things about the cortex is that most often control of body structures is contralateral. That means that structures on one side of the brain actually control structures on the opposite side of the body, or receive sensory information from structures on the opposite side of the body. So I want to quickly mention that while neurobiology is a really exciting field to work in, scientific and pseudoscientific studies of the human brain always deserve extra scrutiny because they have, historically and presently, been used to justify sexism, racism, ableism, and homophobia. In particular, there have been a lot of claims made throughout history about the human brain by eugenicists. Eugenicists are race realists, or people that believe in the idea of biological race. They think that the human gene pool can be improved by promoting reproduction in individuals that have desirable traits and limiting the reproductive freedoms of individuals that have undesirable traits. Now, these restrictions on reproductive freedom have often disproportionately targeted people with disabilities and non-white people throughout history. But as it became less socially acceptable for people to be openly bigoted or racist or ableist, they often tried to use science to justify their prejudices, including phrenology, which tries to link personality traits to brain size and brain architecture. So, for example, people would argue that having a large frontal lobe signified biological beauty and intelligence and reproductive fitness. And then they would use this to rationalize discriminatory policies against people with non-European ancestry, or to label non-white individuals as being dangerous or prone to violence. They also took a lot of real science out of context, like, for example, craniometry, which measures the overall size of the cranial vault. And they would then try to extend that to make, again, claims about intelligence or fitness that don't pan out and have no basis in actual good science. Now, unfortunately, variations of these ideas still persist today, like, for example, with people conducting research looking at gendered or racial differences in the brain. Scientists have a responsibility to consider the implications of their work and the ways in which their work can be manipulated by bigots when it spreads out into society. And equally important, society should always continue to be cautious when presented with any research that's comparing groups of people and essentially looking for differences. So let me be really clear here. Mainstream scientists reject the idea of biological race. There's only one race, and it's the human race. The word race is sometimes used sociologically as a proxy for skin color, but people with different skin colors are more often genetically similar to each other than they are to people that have the same skin color as them. So if we use skin color as a proxy, it's sort of a bad proxy. It's a bad way to sort people into a research group. And people still continue to do it, though. We've seen that most recently with studies looking at susceptibility to COVID-19. But for something as complicated as the brain, because there's just so much that we still don't know, it's especially problematic. So while we're going to be talking about each of the lobes of the brain in a little bit more detail, starting with the frontal lobe, I should mention that what follows is a little bit of an oversimplification of the true structure-function relationships. The borders of the brain regions are not nearly as well defined as these images present, and in many cases, the functions are a lot more complex too. But we have to start somewhere. Now, in humans, the frontal lobe is the largest and most well-developed region of the brain. That's what made it attractive to the eugenicists initially, because that's especially true if we compare it to non-human primates or to other members of the animal kingdom. People used to believe that the frontal lobe was responsible for intelligence, but we know now that that's not accurate. But again, like I said before, for a long time throughout history, people have tried to use that argument to support their bigoted points of view by comparing the size of the frontal lobe or the features of the frontal lobe between people. The frontal lobe is really important though, but its primary job is in decision making, like for example, hypothesis generation or planning and organizing of things that we want to do. It's also responsible for inhibitions. That keeps us from acting on essentially every urge and impulse that we're feeling at any given point. Now, unfortunately for many of you, your frontal lobe isn't fully developed until you're in your early 20s. And that's why the frontal lobe is often discussed at the intersection of neuroscience and the law. It's, for example, one of the reasons why neuroscientists are often brought in to testify in order to prevent minors from being put on trial as adults if they commit crimes. Now, most of the decision making comes from neurons in the gray matter in the frontal lobe in a region called the orbitofrontal cortex. But the frontal lobe has other jobs too. For example, it's involved in our sense of smell, which we actually don't cover in this course, but you can learn more about in Dr. Manuz's course in the PMB department. It's also involved in speech because of a region called Broca's area that we'll talk more about later. And following up on our previous units, it's also the region that contains most of the motor areas responsible for planning and executing many movements. That includes the primary motor cortex, which you'll be hearing us talk about a little bit later in the course.